Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see lots of you again. Welcome back to day two of this conference on New Frontiers in Philanthropy and Investment. It's really, really lovely to have you all here, and hello to everybody who's joining us online. Thanks for being here. For a few of you, it's the first day here, so just a couple of logistics before we get into the meat of the day. The toilets are back out of the door that you just came in from and on your left. A little bit further on, the Horsefelt room is a prayer room, which you're welcome to use if you wish. Fire. So there is usually a fire alarm, a test fire alarm in King's Place at 10 o'clock on Fridays. We're hoping it's been disabled. If, however, the fire alarm does go off at 10 o'clock, don't panic, stay still. If the fire alarm goes off at some time that isn't 10 o'clock, stand up and follow someone in a high-vis yellow jacket. They will take you to where we need to go. Please keep your phones off in here. We have a couple of breaks today. So we're basically running a long morning of sessions this morning. So we're going to have one break sometime around 11 o'clock, and then there is a delicious lunch upstairs again in the Battlebridge room where you came in, and that will be at around 1:30. If you do need to take a break, make a call, have some time out, you're very, very welcome to use the Battlebridge room and the balcony by the canal as well, if you'd like. Just stay comfortable is basically what we're saying. So I hope lots of you who were here yesterday enjoyed all the sessions. As I said at the beginning of the day yesterday, Cassie and I have unashamedly curated this to be jam-packed, full of amazing speakers. We wanted to create as much space as possible to hear from a huge range of people, people who are doing lots of thinking and making and doing. That does mean that it hasn't been interactive, and we kind of made that decision consciously. But we also see these 2 days really as the start of something, and that's very much a whole load of conversations that I hope we can continue to build on. And there'll be some time in a moment to think about where this work needs to go next. Just to get us back into the space for this morning, I just wanted to share a few reflections from me about yesterday's sessions. I'm sure you've all got your own, but here are a few from me. The first thing that I thought is I'm really struck by the fact that we're all at different stages on this journey. And some of the things that we heard yesterday, some of the things I heard yesterday made complete sense to me. Some of them I really struggled to get my head around. And actually, that's fine. That's what learning looks like. That's what exploring looks like. It doesn't all have to add up just yet. So I think I want to hold on to that point today, really, and kind of invite all of us to stay in that zone of possibility that we were talking about yesterday, kind of searching out where are those new frontiers. But I think there is something really interesting in this about the question of language. So Gabriella yesterday talked really beautifully about this importance of transdisciplinary learning and transdisciplinary working, and learning how to bridge divides between people from different backgrounds and different understandings, and finding new language that brings people together. So I think we need to find a way of talking about this work that doesn't leave people feeling, on the one hand, sort of stupid for not getting it or excluded because the language feels too abstract. But at the same time, we need to find a language that kind of allows for precision and nuance, and that honours the complexity of the moment that we're in. And I don't know if we've got that balance right yet, and I don't know what we do about that, but I do think it's a conversation I'd love us to continue. So yeah, that's one reflection. Secondly, I think we spent quite a lot of time yesterday talking, on the one hand, about very big systems that need to change, and on the other hand, about very deep local work, which was all brilliant. I'm also really interested in what sits in the middle of those two things. So quite often at JRF, I talk about this idea of the hidden wiring, the sorts of invisible systems and structures that sort of shape our experience of what's possible. And so I'm kind of thinking, I'm interested for this agenda, what's the hidden wiring that perhaps we didn't spend so much time talking about yesterday? Is it financial regulation? Is it charity law? Is it the planning system? And I guess I'm interested in, for those of us working in philanthropy, what is our role in relation to those things? What is our role in exposing the way in which they might be kind of holding us to a status quo we're not finding helpful, or enabling the emergence of something new and different? Thirdly, I think there was a lot of discussion yesterday over how to fund movements, how to really put money back into the hands of communities. And I think that's obviously incredibly important, and there's an awful lot of work to not only just talk about doing that, but to actually get on and do that. And I know that's something Derek and his panel are going to talk about later today. I'm interested in how we do that, though, without also sort of pushing all the responsibility for systemic transformation onto those movements and grassroots organisations to carry alone. So what is the role of funders and investors, not only in resourcing that work, but also in enabling us to stay as committed to the urgent systemic transformation we need, as well as the commitment to power and equity? How do we do those things together? And I also think related to that, Steph yesterday talked about the Centre for Economic Democracy's kind of framework of resisting work and building work. And I think it's a really interesting question about what do we do, how do we get the balance right between the work we're doing to resist and to challenge and the work we need to do to build alternatives and show what's possible. Another way you might think about it is, Graham talking about the 3 horizons framework. What is the balance of work we need to do across those 3 horizons to actually move forward on this, rather than just continuing to talk about how things might need to be? Fourthly, there was a real sense of joy in the room yesterday, I think particularly in the breaks, when we all realised that actually we're real 3D human beings and we can hug each other and we can say hello. And I think that sense of connection and that sense of finding people who are asking the same questions, or seeing people again who are asking the same questions, has been one of the things that's made the last day and a half really special. And the conversations I've been having with people, I definitely get a strong sense of people wanting to think about how we move this work forward together. Where does it need to go next, and how are we going to figure that out? Yes, so on that, before we move into the remainder of the sessions for the day, I actually wanted to invite everybody, both here and online, just to spend about 5 minutes reflecting on that question of where does the work need to go next. Where does it need to go next? What questions have you been left with? Who needs to be in the conversations? And what I'd like to invite you to do, there's some paper on your chairs. Also, if you want to stay paper-free, which we would welcome, you can also, if you go into the Notion site, which if you're here you can access via the QR code, there's a Google document that you can just type into. So I invite you just to spend the next 5 minutes before we move on to our first session, just reflecting. Talk to your neighbour if you want, spend some time on your own. Stay in here though, please, because we're going to keep moving. Just reflect on that question, where does this work need to go next? And when we come back to you with next steps, we will share some of what you tell us in that document. Okay, enjoy the reflection time. Okay. Sorry that was a short reflection time, but feel free to keep on adding into that during the day. And just to say as well, we also have a feedback form separate from this question of where things need to go next, where you can tell us how we can make this event better and what worked for you and what needs improving. But anyway, I am so excited to start this the first session. I've been looking forward to this one for weeks. We learned in the pandemic that often during crises, our sense of time can collapse, and the feeling of tackling the urgent work can really crowd out that ability to focus on the deeper work that is needed as well. Roman Krasnarek talks about how we treat the future as empty time or as nobody's time, and yet we know that actually it really does belong to our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. The risk is if we discount it, we don't pay attention to what they might need, and it makes it very, very difficult for us to focus on that work that we need to do now if we're serious about tackling climate crisis and rising inequality. So one of the things we need to do is bring future generations and the interests of future generations much more explicitly into our conversations in the present. And we wanted to embody that principle quite literally in this conference. So I'm delighted to welcome to stage Yuan Yang, a Financial Times journalist, and 2 very special guests to open up this conference this morning.
My name is Yuan. And this is Jeevan. And on screen we also have Days joining us. We're a panel spanning 3 decades, from the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. I'll introduce myself first, and then I'll go around to each of the panelists. Today, my name is Yuan. I'm a correspondent at the Financial Times, have been living in Beijing for the last 6 years, and just returned to the UK a few weeks ago and I'm very happy to be able to convene with all of you today. The panel is about bringing the future into the present, and in order to do that, I think we also have to talk about the past and where we're coming from, and the moments in our generations, in our different generations and in our different childhoods that have shaped our view of the future. I went to university at the start of the financial crisis in 2008 to study economics, and it was very clear that from the first day I stepped into the economics classroom that the crises going on in finance, in the environment, in society, were not being reflected in the teaching and training of economists. And that feeling of frustration led me and a group of other economics students to co-found Rethinking Economics, which is a campaigning organization that seeks to change the economics that's taught in universities to make it more pluralistic, more real-world relevant, and more reflective of the problems within the discipline and within the society that we're situated in. So that was a foundational experience of our generation, going to study in the middle of a financial crisis and graduating in the middle of a recession. I'll go next to Jeevan, who's prepared an introduction for yourself too. Do you want to go ahead?
Hello, my name is Jeevan and I'm 7 years old from Birmingham. My mummy told me you are all people with lots of money and things that can help make a better world for me, my friends, and for lots of people in the future. I wanted to tell you about some ideas that I think could help that. First of all, I want to tell you about the donut. I have drawn a picture of 2 things. So don't overshoot the donut, because it is hurting the environment. Stay in the ring of the donut, so stop hurting the environment and help people. Don't fall in the hole. So you really have to work hard to redraw the world, like my friend Kate from Deal says. Secondly, you have to things that are not just a little bit good, like electric cars are only a bit good. They still use lots of materials and factories and create lots of traffic. I love cycling everywhere it's not safe. I need streets that are for bikes and buses and longboards and have clean air. I would like us to look after the bees, the trees, the planet, my family in Punjab, and everyone who is in really hot and really flooded places. My mum is really cool. Her name is Indy. She works at Civic Square, and there I have learned all about the environment and the neighbourhood. Since I have been little, I have met lots of cool people that you have heard in this conference, like Fazana, Kate, and Indy, and Alistair, and lots of people. They are working so hard, and I love helping my mum at work. The environment, my neighbourhood, but sometimes I want my mum to not have to work so hard. I want her to not worry about work and money and all of the people she tries to look after, so we can ride bikes, climb trees, bake cakes, so can help make their life easier, our futures brighter, and the environment healthier, and listen to children more. Thank you for inviting me. Please come to Birmingham and visit our really cool neighbourhood and meet my friends.
And Jeevan, you drew this yourself, right? And for those in the back who might not be able to see it, can you describe what this is?
The donut?
Yeah, this is a picture of a donut from Kate Raworth's writing on donut economics, which describes the limits of the planetary economy and What's this in the middle?
The hole.
That's the hole that we should not be falling into. And on the outside are the healthy limits of the economy. So thank you so much, Stephen, for drawing this for everyone. You can come and have a look at it at the end if you can't see it right now. Do you want to describe what's on the back as well?
So I drew a picture of me on a flag for more bikes and less cars.
So we'll go next to Days, who's joining us on the screen. Days, do you want to briefly introduce what you're doing at Earthrise and anything else you'd like to set the tone?
Yes, thank you so much, Ivan, for your sharing. That was so awesome. So I'm Daisy Garcia, and I'm a climate justice activist. My background, I guess, started in my own issues around the climate crisis and facing air pollution as a teen. And then I went into human rights work of, learning about the importance of how do we create lives of where people flourish. And this kind of took me into the climate crisis as how can we flourish if, the needs of human life are not being fulfilled in the way that it should be. And since then, I've been on this very wild journey of starting in the grassroots movements, moving on to different spaces, working in philanthropy, in theatre, in the arts and culture space. And then last year, I found myself at Earthrise. So Earthrise is a creative agency, and it specialises in telling stories around the climate crisis. And there is something that's really beautiful about basically using empathy as a way to get people to connect. Because the science is, very alarming, but the science doesn't speak to everyone. And what we need to do, once realising that the science doesn't speak to everyone, is provide other venues of people to be able to connect with the crisis. And that's kind of what we do. We create these really beautiful infographic series on social media, which is very Generation Z, to show people about how they can kind of open up to feeling a bit educated about the climate crisis and playing on their curiosity about it. And then now we've kind of gone into this journey of going for longer form content, for example, whether it's one of the series that we did about eco-anxiety with YouTube originals, or whether it's with Water Bear and doing a whole breakdown series on some of the bigger issues around the climate crisis. But I think the most important part of this is how do we educate, but then also how do we inspire? How do we open people's eyes to the awe of wonder of the world? And then also, how can we bring them to be prepared for that big transition that's coming next? The transition that goes into, for example, moving into donut economics, or moving into a world of where we are no longer living in this crisis. And it's kind of getting people prepared. And that's been the bulk of my work over this last year.
Awesome. So in the conversation we had before this panel, Days, you brought up the idea of intergenerational responsibility. So what the responsibility our grandparents, our parents had for us, and our responsibility for those who come after us. And Jeevan's already had a shout out to your mum. What's your mum's name again?
Indy.
Indy, shout out to Indy. What have your parents and your grandparents brought for you, and what do you think is your responsibility for those who come next? Days, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I remember growing up, my mum always said that our role in life is to make the world a better place for the next generation. And that's something that I grew up basically watching my mum envision. My mum came from Nigeria, first generation immigrant. She grew up in poverty in Nigeria, and even I grew up in poverty for the first half of my life. But then my mum, she made things happen and kind of gave me the opportunities that were in her wildest dreams. And I know what it feels like to kind of have someone basically safeguard your future. So when she's always kind of drilled in this idea of we have to make the world better for the next generation, I thought, how can I make the world better for the next generation? And this is what pushed me into this climate space. I feel like I've gone through this massive journey of actually realizing I'm really angry that I've had to give up my youth in order to talk to politicians and basically beg them to listen, beg them to not destroy our Earth, beg them to make this planet continue to be livable, and I hope that Jivan doesn't have to grow up doing this work. So this is kind of like the responsibility that we have for ourselves and one another to kind of make the world a better place for the next generation so they can flourish in a world with minimal restraints.
And you mentioned anger, and I think it's really important to have anger in the room here with us, as well as all the other different feelings that we bring to this morning. And do you think there's anything different about the way in which you and your mother, for example, or different generations, think about responsibility for the future?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and me and my mum have been having loads of different conversations about this. It's so my mum is basically, she kind of was like, how do I make my kids be able to have a roof over their head, eat, and be able to kind of have the fundamentals of life? And that's what she basically strived to provide for us. But for me, I feel like coming into this with, the basic necessities to life, I'm like, how do I make the next generation flourish? How do I make the next generation actually enjoy life rather than surviving life? And I think that's the kind of the difference between my mum's generation and my generation. They are kind of like, like even when I talk about politics, my mum's very political in mind. But before my activism, she wouldn't really do anything about the thoughts that she was having, because she said, at least I can feed my kids and at least I can provide a roof over their head, and that's kind of like, even if things are hard, at least I can provide the bare minimum. But now I think we're moving into a time of where society, we claim that we are developed, but I'm not really seeing that in a way. I'm seeing, levels of climate anxiety and mental health issues in our young people. We're seeing the rise of young people being really angry because this is not the life we were promised when we were told we would have, opportunity and we could do whatever we want. But in reality, that's not the case. So it's about how do, we basically, our generation, kind of make the older generation want more from life. And I think that's what I'm doing. And then even like Jivan is providing us the solutions, So I think there's definitely a difference in the way that we're approaching it.
Yeah, I think there's, when I came back from Beijing to the UK recently, I did have this feeling of the immense amount of wealth that is here. And as Jivan puts it, what do you say in your speech? You are all people with a lot of money. And having that feeling coming from a developing country back to what was one of the richest countries in the world and still is historically, and thinking, what can we do with all this wealth? Because my parents also grew up just after the Cultural Revolution in China, in a country that was still very, very poor. My grandparents grew up in even more impoverished situation just after the Communist Revolution in China. And for both those generations, as with Dais's mum, there's a feeling of scarcity and kind of family-centric, we need to get this unit on our feet, and we need to protect ourselves, we need to defend ourselves against all the risks around us. And that leads to a kind of, you can call it authoritarian or kind of security mindset, the big protective family mindset. We need to survive. And I think what I hear Daisy you saying is, for the next generation, you hope that we can move to thriving, to riding around on our bikes and enjoying that, rather than to this mentality of zero-sum competition and pure survival. And I think what really struck me when coming back to the UK is that this is a country that, by all economic measures, can be thriving in every respect, in every aspect of society, but it is also not. And there's that kind of surprise and that difference of mindset of being for so long in a country in China where there is material lack in many parts of society, but there doesn't necessarily need to be, and finding that conundrum here. So, Daisy, let's talk more about that thriving. What does thriving look like to you in the next generation? What do you hope for?
I feel like for me, thriving is exactly what Jivan has described. It's us living within that donut, where we can provide really good healthcare, we can provide housing for everyone, we can make everyone at least live on the basic standard of what we would expect, which I don't think we are fulfilling now. And then on top of that, it's having the time to think, having the time to engage into the deeper issues. I've just, last year I graduated from university, and the thing that I realized was such a privilege of that time is the time to think and the time to really go deeply into how can I be an active citizen, which sadly is not the case for many people, because many people are stuck in that 9-to-5 continuous working pattern of where you work so hard through the week, by the time you get to the weekend you're sleeping and then it's back again. And it's like, how do we kind of create space for thinking, create space for co-collaborating, create space to actually get to know each other intergenerationally, and how do we kind of take that into the solutions that we're going to see in the future, and how do we allow young people to lead these solutions as well? I think it's really important. How do we build this intergenerational trust that we can say, okay, I trust in the young people to safeguard their future, and I'm here as an elder to hold the ground, to hold the fort, and to add support whenever they need us.
Jivan, do you have any questions you want to ask Days? Not yet. So Days mentioned intergenerational space for convening, and Jivan, you talked about all these people that you met before. Where's the list? At Civic Square. And you met Fazana, Kate, Indy, and Alistair. Do you remember how you met them? You don't remember? So Civic Square was a place where you met all these people, including Kate. And I'm sure for them as well, it's probably the first time they met you and they got to talk to you about their ideas. And is there anything you can describe about what Civic Square was like? Where is it? Is it here, or is it in Birmingham?
It's in Birmingham.
It's in Birmingham. So is it a space? So is it a room? What kind of a space is it?
I can't describe it.
You can't describe it. I really put you on the spot there. So when we talk about places for convening, like what comes up in your imagination? Days, do you want to?
Yeah, I think Civic Square is an amazing. I am a big fan of the work Civic Square does. So if you haven't heard of it, you should definitely find out about it. But yeah, it's about creating the space, and for me, physical space is really important. I've got a lot of training as a trained facilitator, and there is something that's quite magical when we fully see and hear each other. And I'm sure earlier when Sophie was talking about the joy that's been experienced in this conference, it's because people are in real space, can physically hear each other, and can get into a deeper form of listening. And I think having that space of where we can all come together and we can see, especially with younger people, we can see what everyone's offering, and realizing that everyone's offering is so powerful. Like being in a room with Jivan and hearing his thoughts and feelings about where we should be going, what's the world that he wants to live in. This is a form of knowledge that's hardly recognized in the mainstream, but within these spaces of intergenerational community building, we need to make sure that all of us are hearing this and all of us are seeing each other's knowledge as, valid and as necessary to creating the solutions going forward.
And one thing I wanted to ask about was your, Daisy, you talked about your mum's journey from living in poverty, growing up in poverty, to starting a restaurant and then completely changing your class in the space of a few years. I think you mentioned this in your TED Talk, which I'd recommend to everyone. And I think especially for young people, class is so much more defining because we're living in our households, living with our parents. We haven't yet had the opportunity to create a separate definition to our families and where our families come from. So what are some ways you think we can overcome class barriers in bringing young people together?
I think there needs to be this massive need for a shift, a shift in moving forward to equality and justice. Because I know from my own personal experience, I grew up in a one-bedroom flat in Tottenham with 5 other people. That was my everyday reality. And to be honest, it wasn't till my mum started her restaurant that I realised that most people don't live this way, because a lot of the time when we grow up in a certain class bracket, we tend to hang around with those people, and that becomes our world, and we don't really see what happens outside. So I kind of grew up in, what I would say is like relative poverty in this country, and then just seeing how my mum setting up a business and moving into that has changed my life forever. Like, I was able to go to boarding school, I was able to have this really amazing education, and in that turn, even though like academically I've never been a good student, but I was able to find ways of where I can like bed in my success through having the space to explore, which is very much a sign of economic wealth. And this is where, like, when I started doing work around climate change, it wasn't just about climate and the environmental issues, but it was about how do we make sure that this change that we're going to have to do in order to safeguard the environment is a change that actually safeguards people too, is a change that embeds justice into society. Because I know what it's like to move from one bracket to another and experience a whole wealth of different expectations I would never have. And that makes me think, how do we make sure that this happens for other people too? Because people do forget there are people still living in one-bedroom flats in Tottenham with a whole family of 5 to 8. This is the reality of the world, and we need to remember that in order for us to create solutions that benefit everyone.
So I'll end with, from each of us, one image or one feeling of hope for thriving for the future. And I'll start first. My hope is to be able to reimagine and rethink the economy and completely question the assumptions that led us to where we are in the present moment. Jeevan, do you want to give, what's your hope for the next year, let's say? What are you most looking forward to in the next year?
Less cars and keeping more bikes.
Less cars and more bikes, as you can see in this picture here. And you love riding your bike, right? What colour is your bike?
Black, white, blue, red and yellow.
Black, white, blue, red and yellow. So very colourful bikes in the road. And how does it feel when you're riding your bike?
Good.
It feels good. So let's feel good. Days?
Yeah, I second that. I want to see loads of bikes on the streets too, Jeevan. I've just learned how to ride a bike, so I'm joining pretty late, but I'm joining.
Jeevan started to ride at the age of 2, right? You started to ride when you were 2, so.
Amazing. Okay, I hope for a generation where everyone learns how to ride a bike at 2.
Thank you so much for.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that was it. I second you, man.
So more bikes, more colourful bikes, riding from the age of 2, like Jeevan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You were brilliant. And I hope we can all hold on to the messages from Jeevan and Days over the next panel, which I'm very happy to be inviting up to the stage now. Over the last 24 hours, a lot of our speakers and panellists have talked and reflected about the way in which colonialism can't get my words out, has shaped philanthropic practices and mindsets, and how that needs to change, how we need to think about building a reparative future, and one, as Amara was saying yesterday, one that's focused on liberation. And so I'm really happy that we've got a panel now to kind of dive much more deeply into those issues. And it's being chaired this morning by Derek Bardwell, the Chief Executive of 10 Years' Time. And I should also say, and he hasn't asked me to say this, but his book called Giving Back, which is a book about reimagining philanthropy, is out in August, and you can pre-order it now from your local independent bookseller, so please do that. Anyway, Derek, come on up.
Welcome, everyone. Actually, shall I come in over here?
Yeah.
It's a bit more intimate. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here for the session, and a difficult act to follow, but we will do our best. As we embark on this journey in terms of this particular panel, I want to read out this quote as a way of starting, and before I introduce our panelists who will be online and also here in person as well. And this comes from Patrick Vernon, and Patrick Vernon wrote this piece as part of the Racial Justice and Social Transformation report that we released earlier this year. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we were led to believe that the great white men came up with innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship to transform the country from a small trading nation to controlling the resources and a third of the world population by the 19th century. What we now know is that due to the work of scholars such as Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, and Hilary Beckles, among others, the roots of the funding of the Industrial Revolution were based on the enslavement and colonization of Black people and other minoritized communities. This created the wealth and power for a new breed of philanthropists, where their legacy has shaped the development of current endowments and grant-making today. These men used their philanthropy to hide their deeds of violence and exploitation, and rebranded themselves as caring, benevolent individuals with strong Christian virtues in helping the deserving poor and building monuments and a range of social infrastructure to demonstrate a new enlightenment of Britain. And I really wanted to sort of emphasize that as the opening bit around this talk. Very much, at 10 years' time, what we do is we help ambitious philanthropists to disrupt harmful systems and rebalance power and resource, racial and economic justice with care and confidence. And we take a reparative lens, and the reason why that's very important to us and crucial and essential to philanthropy is that this is about giving back. And so when we talk about a reparative lens, we don't speak about it as an end goal, and we don't speak about it as the destination. We talk about it as a stepping stone towards reparations, a stepping stone from the conception of giving to giving back. We talk about it as moving from philanthropy as an institution, and that's what we have at this particular time, philanthropy as an institution, to one that is a cultural practice forefronted by those most impacted by the social harms. So you could call it, in terms of how some of this conference has been built in terms of the Three Horizons framework around the H2, so that transition towards what we are envisaging. And for this to happen, I think there are three crucial things. There may be a few more, but there's three crucial things. One, understanding history. So understanding that the UK economy has been built, and where wealth and power and access has been built and decided upon racial lines in that era of empire, colonization, and slavery. That the underdevelopment of the geopolitical South was an intentional consequence of Europe's quest of the globe. And the fact that all of these disparities that we see in our society show up in philanthropy today, and it shows up in how wealth has been accumulated, how it is invested, who makes the decisions, who receives the money, who has the privilege to think that I am not talking about you. A sector that bows to the confidence of those wearing suits at the expense of trusting those who experience the atrocities that I'm talking to you about. So it's understanding history. The second part is around challenging and invalidating one's own truths. If we're talking about leadership and leadership in philanthropy, this is absolutely crucial. It's absolutely crucial that people challenge their own truths and understand that sacrifice, that social change and transformation does not happen without sacrifice, and that all of our legacies are online if that is what we're talking about. We also have to recognize that this is not a lifestyle issue, this is a life and death issue. And then the third bit, it's around imagination. If we cannot genuinely imagine another world or imagine an alternative, we're not going to get very far. We have to imagine something that is going to be different. And we've heard from a number of speakers who are reimagining our worlds and who are imagining a different future for us. Again, we have to think outside of our frameworks, and we have to think more about what can be as opposed to what we're restricted by. And I'll say this, in envisaging a world where there's no longer foundations or charitable trusts, and where that money is being recirculated into communities to facilitate growing power, it will happen. It's going to happen. It's just a question of what we will do in our positions to make that happen. Now today, we have some wonderful, wonderful panelists, and I'm so glad that they are coming from across the globe in terms of the work that we are doing, because this is a universal struggle. And we know that philanthropy has a tendency to put borders up, tends to divide, it tends to silo. And I think what we want to do in this conversation is to tear down those silos and move away from borders and things that divide us towards tearing down those borders and talking about things that will unite us. We have Vanessa Thomas from Decolonizing Wealth Project, who will be talking to us a little bit about liberating capital. We have Laurence Meyer from the Digital Freedom Fund, who will be talking about philanthropy as a tool for reparations. And we were hoping that Carly Akuno from Cooperation Jackson will be with us to talk about solidarity economy. I don't think he will be able to join us. As I understand, he's in Spain somewhere. I'm still holding out hope that we'll get him, but we might not, okay? But I'm not gonna rule it out yet. And we also have Luam Kadan from Thousand Currents, who will be talking about Indigenous governance and movement building. And I've asked each of the panelists to start off by responding to the question about what a reparative lens looks like to them and what the role of philanthropy is in terms of that. And then I'll be asking some questions afterwards after they're presented. And just before I hand over to Vanessa, I just want to invite everyone to enter this space with curiosity and in a spirit of curiosity, to spend the time to abandon your frameworks and to stop yourselves from jumping to conclusions, and also just to stay as best as possible present with what we're saying, and also to think to yourself, once you leave this space, what will you commit to doing differently once you leave this particular space? So Vanessa, I'm going to hand the mic to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Derek. This is so strange. I can see myself on screen and I feel like I'm being interviewed on Channel 4 News or something. Anyway, very, very surreal. Before I start, it's just so wonderful seeing an all-Black panel, so thanks for having us. I like to see things like this. But yes, like Derek said, I am Vanessa Thomas. I'm currently the Director of Global Programs at the Decolonizing Wealth Project, and we are an American-based foundation that disrupt the flow of capital through education, radical reparative giving, and narrative change. For my sins, I have spent most of my career in philanthropy, and I've tried to cause trouble at every stage, questioning the odd colonial norms like who is typically funded, to the harmful, reductive, and racist narrative. I see philanthropy, and I think Derek has started the conversation on this, but I don't see it as benevolence or a nice deed, but actually a reparative tool that redresses harms that have enabled society today, and harms that, quite frankly, philanthropy benefited and or participated in. So a reparative lens for me is actually the base that I think all of philanthropy should start from. As reparative giving, specifically reparations, is love in action. So to give some wider context, the United States was built on a history and practice of enslavement, genocide, and extraction, often from indigenous peoples and African descendants. And this has resulted in more than 400 years of policies and practices that have fueled economic extraction and systemic violence. Our dear United Kingdom is not so innocent either. The British Empire was the largest that the world has ever seen, and by the 19th century, the UK had its flag in every continent. Although the focus is often on the UK leading the charge for abolition, for close to 250 years, the UK were one of the biggest players in the transatlantic slave trade, with the wealth from African bodies moving into philanthropy and endowments like the universities of Oxford and Glasgow. The major industrialisation and economic growth that the UK saw up from Liverpool and down to Bristol was due to these endeavours. We're here because they were there. And now 10% of the current population are from former colonies and or descendants of enslaved people. So I give this grounding to show the direct correlation that centuries of extraction and brutalization have played in industrializing much of Europe and the USA, and in both these regions accumulating wealth. Now, if you contrast this with the countries that are demarcated as low income, and then the stats you see from health to wealth across Black communities, are Black and brown folks across the globe just very lazy and not entrepreneurial enough? No. The common denominator in all of this is European enslavement, colonialism, and exploitation. And I think when you view it through this lens, you understand that philanthropy is more than just do-goodism. It's actually righting a wrong. The poverty and social ills that we are all trying to eradicate in this sector is a product of public policy and theft facilitated by white supremacy. I'm going to say that line one more time. The poverty and social ills that we are trying to eradicate in this sector is a product of public policy and theft which has been facilitated by white supremacy. So to achieve any kind of restorative justice, this racial reckoning is really critical. And a repair of the harms caused and still being caused today because of it is the only way forward for true social justice. Philanthropy through a reparative lens is the ultimate way to build power in communities from which wealth has been stolen. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you, Vanessa. Lawrence.
First of all, I'm really happy to be here with all of you. It's a very nice, beautiful panel. So I guess I have to talk about why philanthropy can be a tool for reparation, or how. So the why is pretty clear now. I think Derek spoke about it. Vanessa, you spoke about it. The why is because philanthropy has caused and continue to cause a lot of damages. So if we look at it from a historical perspective, right, we know that the roads, the fords, the bushes of this world have caused and have participated, and the nobles of this world, have participated directly, indirectly to colonial enterprises, have profited from it. Philosophically, in a just world, there is no need for philanthropy. And so if we are understanding that, we know that the only aim of philanthropy is to create the condition of its own obsolescence. A philanthropy that is actually trying or sustaining itself is part of the problem. So I think then we can talk about what are the steps to reparation. First one is acknowledgement. On a global scale, right? Acknowledging that philanthropy is part of the problem, but also in each foundation, doing the work of investigating how your foundation profited and is still profiting from colonial dynamic, systemic violence, exploitation, extractivist dynamic, the death of millions of people that are Black and brown. Doing this work, the acknowledgement, speaking about why philanthropy participated in destroying different type of world making, of dreams, of ways of knowing, of ways of loving. How did your foundation profited from that is key. Why is it key? Because as long as you don't do the work of really deep acknowledgement of that, you are not engaged in the work. You are going to say, you can do a quick declaration and say like, yeah, racism is a systemic issue. But how are you participating in that is the condition to understand how you can repair, right? So just examining, okay, that's how we participated in that. And also acknowledging the grief. Acknowledging that there are things that can never be returned. That are things that have been stolen that we will never get back. And that it means for Black and brown people that we live in a state of constant grief. Existential grief, and also just like constant actual grief. I'm thinking about what happened in Melilla recently, of 32 people that lost their lives because of the borders regime that the European Union is imposing on black lives. We are living in this grief all the time as black and brown people. How are you profiting from that? So acknowledgement is one step, but acknowledgement can only be the very, very small beginning, as Derek said, I think. Because acknowledgement without action is actually only public relation, it's only a public relation stunt. So how do you put yourself in a position to act? It's about changing the framework. Once you've acknowledged that actually you're part of the problem, you know that you are not giving money because you're generous. You have an obligation to return the money. So it's not about you, it's not about you having the privilege and the generosity to say, oh, this is a good action, let me support it. It's about you just like giving the money back to where it belongs, and to an extent that is not even at the measure of what was stolen. So if you understand philanthropy as a way of returning money and returning at least a bit of the wealth that has been stolen, then you change your whole grant-making framework. How do you decide who your grantees are? How are you deciding the priorities? Why are you in a position to decide to begin with, right? It is not your money. It has never been your wealth. So the only reason you're in this position is because of violence. It's because of death. So you are not in a position, actually, to decide. Returning the money, not imposing rules on people. How are you exiting relationship with grantees? Are you just like deciding on a whim, oh, this is not our priorities anymore, sorry, bye? And why are you exiting those relationships? What is the role of reporting in your foundation? Is it a way of control? Is it a way of asserting power again over your grantees? Why do you need those information? Who put you in a position to need this information to begin with? There are two conversations that are key in what I'm saying now. One is one with Jennifer Kamau, who is one of the founders of an organization that is called International Women's Space, that is an organization in Berlin. And Jennifer Kamau is working with us on the decolonizing process at DFF, and she's part of a group that used to be called Collaboration, that is now called Partnership. And she was saying the only way to do real partnership is by acknowledgement. As long we know why we're here, as Vanessa told us, right? We're here because you were there, so we know. But do you know why you're in your position? And if we can't have this dialogue, then there is no partnership possible. The second conversation I want to acknowledge is one I had with Hakima Abbas, who is one of the founders of the Black Feminist Fund. And she said, our role as funders is to take the risks so that people can do the work that they have been doing for years. So are you risk taker, or are you actually an agent of the status quo? I think it's really important when you think about your grant-making framework. How are you always taking risks for your grantee, instead actually just like trying to secure your relationship with other funders, with other foundation, your ways, your appearances as a benevolent agent. And finally, the third condition to understand philanthropy as a reparation tool, and those are like just beginning of thoughts, right, is to create the conditions of healing, of radical change, of transformation, that is organizing our own obsolescence. What does it mean? Is that while you're talking about racial justice, while you're funding racial justice organizations, are you still accumulating wealth? If you're doing that, you're a hypocrite. Are you, in the way you're doing it, are you really genuinely thinking about how you can disappear? Because that's the only condition. How are you entering in relationship at a scale that allows for change? If you're a big foundation, the scale you're operating at is probably not the scale that is going to be appropriate for relation building, for trust building, for having transformational, relational frameworks instead of transactional ones. I think that's it for now, and I'll just pass it on to you.
Luan.
Yeah, just a few tidbits shared by Laurence. I'm happy to be here with you and in conversation about a variety of topics that we probably could spend hours on. Thank you, Vanessa and Derek and Laurence, for the comments that you've made so far. A lot of things that I was already going to say, so I think I'll pivot a little bit in my comments and talk through a little from the perspective of Thousand Currents. So the foundation that I work for is called Thousand Currents. It's a public foundation that funds work across food sovereignty, economic justice, and climate justice in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and I'm the director of global programs at the organization. So in addition to the context that were shared by Derek, Vanessa, and Laurence, that obviously informs the way that we see our work and how we can support the movements and grassroots formations that we fund. But another thing that also informs our work is looking at the flow of finances within philanthropy. So what we know based on data from Human Rights Funders Network, Candid, Ariadne, and Prospera is that if you add up all of the foundation grants, bilateral, multilateral institution funding, around $6.8, $6.7 billion goes, generally speaking, to human rights funding. Of that $6.8 billion, and I mean, given that there's people that we all know that we read in the news about that are making hundreds of millions of dollars per day as private profits, so $6.8 billion to a world fighting for justice is minuscule. Of that $6.8 billion, 62% of those dollars from philanthropy flows into North America and Western Europe, leaving then 24.9% of that funding to go into Asia and the Pacific, the Caribbean, Central and South America, the Middle East, and Africa combined. So that funding, that data is something that we hold in our work. The other thing that we're also holding is that we know that change is driven by movements, people power, and not policy. Policy responds to shifts that are demanded by a collective mass. And so for the sake of the comments that I'm making here, I'm understanding movements as interconnected, strategically aligned organizations, groups, formations, and collectives that are attempting to shift power and also change culture. So given that we know that movements are the ones that are at the front lines of change, given that the majority of the world does not live in Europe or North America, we'd expect that grassroots organizing would be a clear priority, but only 8% of that $6.7 billion goes to support grassroots organizing. And the more you parse out those numbers, the bleaker the work gets, or the data gets. So picking up from what Laurence was saying about the Black Feminist Fund and the Human Rights Funders Network recently did put out an article, and in that article they mentioned that of the funding that goes to human rights funding, 0.1% to 0.35% of annual grant dollars from foundations goes then to support Black feminist organizing. So the numbers just get to the point where they're really just not even useful in terms of the type of money that's being moved. We need to be moving more money. So given what we know, then what is the approach that we take? In a world, and this has been said now 3 different times, but I'll add it because it's important to reiterate. In a world that is just, philanthropy would not exist because the extraction and exploitation that allows for wealth to be accumulated wouldn't be legible in a just world. So given that, Thousand Currents' approach to the work is that the principal aim of philanthropy needs to be to create a more enabling environment for the systems change work that movements are doing. So given what we know, given what the approach is that we do, given the approach to the work, what then do we do? So we fund a diversity of movements, including non-registered formations with core funding. And why do we do this? We do this because transformative systems change work is driven by movements, again, people building power from below, and not by top-down policy initiatives. There's lots of evidence and data to back this up. Happy to talk to you about that later. We fund movements with core funding because funding movements is not only just, but it's also effective. We fund movements with core funding because people who are on the front lines are best placed to be setting the agenda for what needs to happen. We fund movements with core funding because they are the ones that have developed the proven, interconnected, complex, and interrelated solutions that we need to solve the multiple crises that we're in, whether political, economic, social, or environmental. But in addition to funding, there's also an additional responsibility that we understand ourselves to have as a philanthropic foundation. And in that is that we, as part of the work to create a more enabling environment for movements that are doing systems change work, one of the things that we hold as central to the work that we do is donor education and donor organizing. This includes programs like the Thousand Currents Academy, which is a training program for people that are working within philanthropy who are interested in learning more about how to cultivate philanthropic practices that are creating more enabling environments for movements to do the systems change work that would render philanthropy obsolete, yes, thank you. And also the Academy involves political education work on the thematic areas, so climate justice, food sovereignty, and economic justice, so people can understand a nuanced way of engaging these three thematic areas that are not siloed but interrelated. You can't talk about climate justice and not talk about the need for feminist leadership. You can't talk about food sovereignty and how we're growing food without talking about the territorial rights of indigenous peoples and corporate capture of multilateral institutions that are making it so that our spaces for dialogue are spaces for how to increase profit and not how to save our planet. Another key way that we support movements is that we try to ensure a constant learning or a constant internal learning approach and culture that prioritizes ensuring that our systems are there to make it easier to move more money to movements with less bureaucracy. Given that we know that movement building is not linear, we also recognize the need for flexible and adaptable learning tools so that we don't value numeric and short-term outcomes, incremental siloed solutions over holistic, process-based solutions from the grassroots. The amount of times I've heard people within philanthropy say, well, we do this because this is what our data is showing. Well, then change what you're asking so that you get different data. So in conclusion, what I'm saying is fund movements, trust movements, and if you don't always get it right, then learn from movements.
I have a number of questions, but the first one that I really want to ask, and Vanessa, I'll come to you first, is, you know, particularly in the last couple of years post George Floyd, while the narrative has changed, power hasn't changed. There's been lots of performative actions by funders, and we've got to a state where it feels in conversation everyone is slightly not sure what to do, fearful, scared, not sure how they dip their toes into it. So there might be the will is there, but not necessarily the governance structures or the other things. While there needs to be a level of honest reflection, there also needs to be some urgent action as a result. Vanessa, coming to you first, in terms of what are some of the steps that you believe that funders should start taking now in terms of the more urgent radical action? What are some of your thoughts in terms of your experiences, of what you've seen worked, and what some of those actions should be?
Great question, Derek. And before I get into it, I just have to say, sorry if you just see me completely nodding in the background, because everything that the panel has said so far has just been absolutely brilliant. But yeah, you raise a really good point. I think we're in a really interesting period of philanthropy where philanthropy has kind of woken up to racism, but then it also still doesn't really want to relinquish power or control, as that's the deep and the hard stuff. So I think, like you said, Lawrence, it's so far it's been very much a public relations exercise. So you post your black square, you put something on your website about being committed to diversity and inclusion, and then it's business as usual. So I think, firstly, to say if you're really about social justice, then the thread that should be throughout all of your work should be centering racial justice. racial justice isn't just an ad hoc program. So a lot of funders, when COVID first emerged, kind of had COVID programs, which were COVID funding programs where Black and brown-led communities could apply for funding, and it's like, tick, that's done, back to business as usual. No. This should weave throughout all of your work. And some practical points on what this can look like. Well, in all of your funding, and it feels odd to even say this because it should just be the norm, but in all your funding should center lived experience. So for example, you need to trust that Black disabled folks, because yes, you can be Black and disabled, are the best people to determine what a funding program catering to Black disabled people looks like. And I don't mean bringing them in at the final step to rubber stamp the final decision that you've already predetermined, but really weaving this lived experience in from the get-go. There's barely any diversity in the top FTSE 100 companies, and yet they're still more diverse in philanthropy, and that's really, really alarming. And whilst representation politics isn't it, and we've seen at the moment with a few political leaders going for the PM's job, by representation politics really, really isn't the hill to die on. Philanthropy does need to look radically different. So where you don't have the staff representation of the communities that you're supporting, you need to make sure that you're centering lived experience through the advisors, through committees, through consultants, and you need to pay them competitively. There was a kind of odd thing where some funders now understand that you need to bring in folks with lived experience, fine. And then it's like, well, should we pay them? Okay, well, if we pay them, let's not pay them the market rate because lived experience isn't really expertise. It really, really is. And this is the way that really allow you to kind of meaningfully invest in philanthropy in a transformative way. And then beyond funding, I know we've touched on this, but I just want to hone into what are the knowledge systems that you're lifting up? Are you still viewing funding through project cycles? I really, really loved everything you were saying, Lauren, about how Thousand Currents operate, because social justice isn't linear. So if your organization impact and success is still rooted in outputs and numbers, and the work is tied up in a nice 3-year bow project cycle, this needs to be reevaluated. I'm not saying there's no importance in gathering data or in knowledge sharing, because obviously there is. But again, the cogs of what this is and how it works should be determined at the very least in partnership with the folks that you're supporting, not by a far removed board or a senior leadership team. Beyond not being the best use of time for grantee partners or grant managers, this bureaucracy sets folks up to fail, and it really reaffirms white supremacy, which bows down to the written word, numbers, data, linear, simplistic lives, everything that reality just isn't. And I think I'll just end by saying that challengingly, a lot of this work does involve letting go. And that doesn't mean making yourself redundant or that your knowledge isn't important, but pivoting the role of your organization and individually to one that amplifies the voices of those that are excluded, trusts and funds courageously, and works in a partnership, which means that sometimes you follow rather than lead, and sometimes you listen rather than talk, forging relational as opposed to transactional connections. We really need to listen and fund in colour, and this is something that the principal of Decolonizing Wealth Projects and my boss, Edgar, says a lot. We need to fund in colour. And by that, I mean really hear, respect, and value the nuances and wealth of perspectives and solutions outside of what we know. To listen in colour, we are listening openly without controlling the parameters of what can be said. We're listening with empathy, and we're allowing the experiences of the speaker to permeate, listening for what is said beyond the words spoken. So in short, free up, untether resources, and get out of the way.
Sorry, I like that. Free up the resources and get out of the way. Lawrence.
The same question?
Yes.
I feel like everything has been said. Action, that's the question, right?
Yeah, just what funders can do to get out of the way and start
to get out
action.
of the way. I think there is something to be said about how your internal structure informs your external work. So I think Vanessa already touched upon that, but the only way the change can be long-lasting is to change profoundly the way your organization works, which means also divesting from the whole idea of workshopping your way out of racism. That doesn't work. And thinking that having a diversity and inclusion plan is going to be enough, because that's only thinking that the problem of racism is a problem of image, it's a photo. So like we need more color in the photo, we need a Benetton ad, this is not the problem. So how does your structure doesn't allow for a sufficient number of radical voices coming from the margin to think and reimagine the way money moves? I think that's the first question, because in all foundations, the answer can be different, right? There is not a one-to-fit-all kind of thing, but if you create the conditions in your foundation for that to happen, for the imagining to happen, then the result will come up. So like, how do you change, how do you divert from data-centric ways of understanding your work or measuring impact to more like storytelling, to more relational? That's a huge question. That's really complicated. And it might be really different depending on the situations. I know like at DFF, we're trying to do it right now, and it's complicated because we can say, it's a catchphrase, right? To say like, we have to move from transactional to relational, sounds good, it also rhymes, but actually doing it is just like unlearning everything you've been taught to do in order to succeed. So it's profound, it's challenging emotionally, intellectually, and it needs space. It needs a network that sustains you while you're going through it, because if not, you will abandon it very quickly. So how does your structure really allow you to do this emotional, intellectual journey? I know Anasya Sengupta is going to talk afterward, and she often says that decolonizing in so many ways is an epistemological question, right? It's a question of like, how do you get to knowledge, and what is your framework of knowledge? And to just change that is changing the world. So like, if you want to be able to change your philanthropic work, you have to put the conditions internally to do so. And it's the only ways you will be able to have an external impact that is long-lasting. So really taking the time, taking the 4 years to reimagine completely your foundation, it's going to be in the long run actually more beneficial than just like doing exactly like it's our racial justice year, that's a really cool grant, and that's it. Because yeah, racism is not a trend, and the work shouldn't be as well.
Thank you. Go on.
Hiya. What would be useful? I mean, I think in addition to what's already been said, I think one of the ways to think about scale differently and to expand how you understand what scale is. And so in the journey of trying to figure out how to be better partners to the movements and movement formations that we fund, one of the ways that we realized we needed to shift was to have a broader understanding of what we understand as scale. So the way that we understand the scale now is that it can be both depth, it can be both breadth, and also influence. And so philanthropy often looks at, okay, well, there's 100 million people being impacted, great, that looks really great in my board report, look at what we've been able to do, and to our donors. But actually, given that change is a really complex and nuanced process that requires different types of interventions, it's important to be able to fund those different interventions. And in order to be able to do that, you need to understand scale differently. So for example, depth, one of the ways to understand this is that we have a partner, the Amadiba Crisis Committee, works across 5 villages in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, resisting an Australian mining company that's been trying to, in collaboration with the South African government through their foreign direct investment programs, install a mining site that would destroy the natural habitat. We've been funding them, and they work with directly with 3,000 to 4,000 people, but some of their strategic litigation work is precedent setting, not just across Africa, but across the global south in terms of the rights of indigenous peoples to have a veto on any development on their land. This is also particularly important because 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by indigenous communities that work in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 communities, and not by global and international INGOs. But we would miss that if we didn't understand that depth is an integral way to understand scale. An example for breadth is, for example, we have a partner in Brazil. The Landless Peoples Movement works across the country, but also in the region around food sovereignty, solidarity economy as a vision for economic justice, in addition to peasant feminisms and a host of other things. Their work is rooted in ensuring that there is both territorial integrity for indigenous peoples, that rural workers have dignified lives, but they also, through their cooperative networks, have one of the largest organic rice producing mechanisms in the region. Again, done through a solidarity economy, cooperative framework that centers the dignity of workers and not profit as the kind of driving logic for why the work is done. And then there's influence, and influence here can look in many different ways. One of the ways that an example that might be helpful in this space is La Via Campesina, over 180 million peasants, rural workers, indigenous peoples, fisherfolk, pastoralists, and they are in different policy spaces, whether it be around the binding treaty space for transnational corporations, or in the UN General Assembly space to try to push for a declaration around the rights of peasants and rural workers. And so if you understand that scale is nuanced and it comes in a variety of different ways, your funding portfolio will be able to be composed of a more realistic viewpoint of how change actually happens. And so I think that's one thing that can be a pretty immediate shift, is looking at your strategic plan and understanding how your vision of scale is impacting it, and whether or not you could shift your visions of scale, and what then would your portfolio and your strategy look like.
Thank you. We're drawing to a close, but I wanted to ask a slightly, and this is really bad for me to ask this impossible question when we've only got about 5 more minutes left. But just in terms of, you have these structures, these charitable trusts, foundations, funders, who have these particular structures that, in terms of funding racial justice, at this point are not fit for purpose. And they're trying to move to that. And for that's like a huge ocean to get to that point. Are there any, very quickly, and I'm opening it up to everyone, sort of key principles in terms of how you get to a point of starting to fund the unknown, or fund the radical imagination, or fund the future? Is there any principles or things that you have seen in terms of practices where you would say, if you're not there yet, but you need to take the leap, here's 1 or 2 things that I would suggest would need to happen, or key principles that would underpin that? But just quick snapshot. Vanessa, do you want to go? Sorry, Vanessa, I've come to you again.
No, I can't believe we're already near the end. I promise I'll be succinct, but I think it's definitely been touched on, but I'll give some practical examples. In the States, I kind of straddle a really interesting role where I see what foundations and funders are doing in America and what foundations and funders are doing in the UK. And last year or the year before, regular, middle-of-the-road foundation, the Bush Foundation, released $100 million, which they've given to 2 community funds to go to Black communities and Native American communities. And this was very much kind of responding to the book Decolonizing Wealth that the foundation that I work at, but recognizing that they didn't have the internal expertise or the community connection. So they released the $100 million. 50 million has gone to a Native American community organization, called NDN Collective. and the other half have gone to a Black-led community organisation called Nexus. And this is Bush recognising money needs to go to our communities to kind of start to redress some of the harms and fill the racial wealth gap. They don't have the internal cogs yet to make it work, so they've released this money. And at the same time, they've released an additional $50 million, which is going to go towards the roots of kind of why there even is a racial wealth gap. So this was, I think, a foundation responding to the call to diversify and to equitably redistribute wealth in a really quick. There was probably things going on in the background which took a while, but this was just the easy way of them going, we don't have the internal whatever to get this to happen, and we also recognize it is maybe not our place to be doing this work, but we know who should. So I think that's a really practical example of just stop using the excuses of we don't know how, it's tricky, and go and find some Black and brown organisations who do, because there's plenty of them. Black Feminist Fund, as Ram has already mentioned, the Baobab Foundation in the UK, we're everywhere, so stop using the excuse of we don't know how, just give us the money and I'll do the work.
I'd add Project Taloa to that list as well. Lawrence.
Yeah, I think just let's stop with project funding. First of all, like give core, flexible, multi-year grants to small grassroots organizations. Don't ask them too much about like how their structure is, because sometimes they just like don't have structures. They just have like ways of doing. That's the first thing. I think like just let's start the project funding approach and do flexible multi-year funding. That works really.
Thank you. Lua.
Okay, so quickly. I think one, the different policies, regulations, laws that govern any kind of philanthropic institutions, there's nothing inevitable about them. And you can get creative legal teams that are really interested in making processes easier to move money rather than how you keep your money. So that's one thing. Creative legal teams that are not risk adverse for systems change is one. Another one is what's already been said, move money to intermediaries or feminist and women rights funds that are already past these initial stages of trying to figure this out, so that the money's not sitting while you're figuring it out. We need to move money. We're in a crisis. There is no more time. The planet is at risk. People in the global south are dying today. And having conversations when you're putting it within that kind of frame of urgency, we need to move money. And then lastly is just continue to learn, be in conversations with your peers, be in conversation with people outside of the funding world as well. There's a lot of really interesting and innovative work that's happening around organizational experiments as you're shifting your structures, what change management looks like. So just reach to the resources that aren't just in your kind of immediate circle, but expand your circles as well.
Brilliant. I'm going to draw this conversation to a close. One of the key messages, move money, get out of the way. And also I think that message here around, in a just world, there would not be a need for philanthropy. And I think we need to really reflect upon where we get to that point. But just in conclusion, I just want to say an absolute huge thank you to the panelists who were just on fire, and just want to say thank you for your time and energy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant, and some really important messages about how to move beyond the fear of getting things wrong to action. So we've got a break now for about 20 minutes. The refreshments are just outside this door, so if we could be back in here for 11:30 for our final two panels of the conference. Thank you very much.